So now let's look at some mechanisms of gas exchange. Gas exchange is synonymous with respiration. Respiration, however, is not synonymous with cellular respiration. Both depend on the same gases, though. So respiration is taking in oxygen and releasing carbon dioxide overall. In humans, it depends on the lungs and the heart and the blood vessels. And that is what we call the circulatory system, the heart and blood vessels at least. And we're looking at the oxygen coming from the environment into the animal and the carbon dioxide coming from the animal out into the environment. Now this is necessary for cellular respiration because, as we know, oxygen is needed for that to occur in the mitochondria. And then a waste product from the breakdown of the molecules is carbon dioxide, and that needs to be gotten rid of. So you need to respirate in order to do cellular respiration, but they're not exactly the same thing. When we look at respiratory surfaces overall, they're thin and moist. And that's because the oxygen and carbon dioxide just diffuse across the cell membranes. So they're always going to be going from high to low, and they can only travel relatively small distances with this diffusion. So when we have a small animal like an earthworm here, or a roundworm or flatworm, etc., they can do respiration right across their skin. These are one layer of cells right up next to capillaries where the deoxygenated blood, which is represented in blue here, is coming in, dropping off its carbon dioxide, and then picking up oxygen, which goes back out into the body. Gills are another type of surface that oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange can happen across. You'll notice that gills are very feathery. That increases the surface area that the exchange can happen, because the more surface area you have, the more oxygen can come in and the more carbon dioxide can go out, which means the more respiration can occur. Gills can dry out very easily, as well as these body surfaces. So both of these need to be in pretty much wet environments, or completely in water in the case of these gills. And you can see it's the same mechanism here. The capillaries right up against the outer layer of cells, and the gas exchange happens across that. In fish, the gas exchange happens based on in two steps. So the first one's ventilation, which is when the fish look like they're gulping in the water as they swim. That's going to be moving the water across their gills, and that's ventilating. And then the second part is what we call the countercurrent flow. So counter means opposite, and current means the flow. So what this is really looking at is that the water going from in through the mouth and out through the gills flows, if we look at this bottom right picture, from the left to the right. The blood coming from the body across the gills is actually going to be flowing from the right to the left. And what does that do? That allows for the most oxygen to get from the water into the blood. And as you know, diffusion happens from high concentrations to low. So when oxygen is very high, it's going to diffuse into the blood. And as it loses oxygen, it's going to become less and less able to diffuse into the blood. So if you put it where oxygen is very low, because in the water after it flows across, so at the end of the flow it's low, and that's matched with the low oxygen blood, you can still see 15% oxygen is more than 5, and so the diffusion will still occur into the blood vessels. If you flip this arrow around and the water and the blood were flowing in the same direction, you'd have, by the time you got to 50%, then you'd have 40% in the water and 60% in the blood, and your oxygen would start flowing from the blood back into the water. So it's important because it just sets up a situation where your low oxygen blood and your low oxygen water are near each other, and your high oxygen blood, high oxygen water are near each other. And it increases the efficiency and amount of oxygen that can get into the blood. So those are looking at surfaces that are in water or very moist environments. Water is not as oxygen rich as air. However, it does moisten the surface. Water is not all equivalent as well. Cold water has more oxygen than warm water, fresh water more than salt water, and water that's turbulent has more than still water. So the organisms that live in different types of water have to have different gill adaptations in order to get the amount of oxygen they need. Organisms that live in air, they have the advantage of having really high oxygen levels, but they have a disadvantage of losing water from those breathing surfaces. So one mechanism that animals have to prevent water loss in air is what the insects use. It's called a tracheal system. So the tracheal system is basically a bunch of small tubes. So there's all these little holes in the body of the insect. You can see it here. And in those holes is where the gas exchange occurs. And so the oxygen is going to go into the holes and branch through all these tubes, and the carbon dioxide will come from the tubes back out the hole. And all those tubes have to reach all the interior of the body. So that's one of the reasons insects can't be all that big. It's because the oxygen has to diffuse all the way into the inside. And what happens is that as it goes through these tubules, they get smaller and smaller, and there's air sacs for storing oxygen. And eventually each cell is touched by a small tubule. And that is where the gas exchange happens. In insects, gas exchange is not through blood or anything like that. It's straight across these tubules into the cells directly. When we look at the transition of vertebrates from water to land, we have our tiktaalik here. And one of the things that they should, if you have watched the Neil Shubin show us tiktaalik, if we looked on the underside, it had these really big interlocking ribs, which showed us it had lungs. It also has gills. And so we can see this transition between lungs and gills. And the idea here is that with this neck happening at the same time they have lungs and gills, that probably means that tiktaalik and the other transitional forms from water to land, they had lungs to gulp air, but also gills to still live in the water, and they probably could push themselves up to gulp air out of the water and then go back under. So it's not so much that the legs evolved first and then the lungs, not at all. They look like they have lungs and lungs and fins still at the same time. So we're really looking at a fish that has lungs that is gulping air. These are the tetrapods. So amphibians, they have small lungs and they have moist body surfaces which diffusion happens across. Non-bird reptiles, so that's things like the turtles and lizards and snakes and crocodilians, they have simpler lungs. Their metabolism is really low, so they don't use all that much oxygen. Birds and mammals, however, being endothermic, use a lot of energy. And what that means is they have to do a lot of cellular respiration to keep making ATP. Cellular respiration, of course, means you have lots of carbon dioxide waste and lots of oxygen needed. So that's where lungs come into play. They have lots of surface area, and they're inside the body, so they stay moist. And again, the gas exchange happens right across, and this would be the alveoli, really, where the gas exchange is occurring. Really high surface area, so you can get lots of carbon dioxide out and lots of oxygen in. So here's the human respiratory system. So nasal cavity and the pharynx, that's both where the oxygen comes in and through the mouth too. And then we have the pharynx, then the trachea, the bronchus or bronchi. Bronchioles are smaller, and then at the end, like I was saying, they're alveoli, which are these little sacs. And those sacs have tons of capillaries all around them where the gas exchange occurs. So lots of surface area. As you probably have heard, smoking is bad for you. One of the reasons for that is because of the damage it does to your lungs. And besides just destroying the lung tissue, it also has problems with the cilia that are in your lungs. And this, the cilia's normal job is to wave, and they sweep mucus along the respiratory tract. And that keeps, when you clear your throat, you'll notice that you have mucus come up, and then you swallow it, and then it clears that stuff from your lungs, so you're not having particles in there. Well, the cilia are paralyzed basically and sometimes damaged beyond repair by smoking. And so what that means is you can't clear that mucus buildup. And the mucus is good, right, because it traps the bacteria and particles, but you can't get it out. So that's why smokers have these very harsh coughs, and they're coughing all the time. And parts of that is because they can't get that mucus up because they don't have the cilia. Smoking is also a problem because it increases the risk of many types of cancer. Lung cancer, obviously, primarily, but you can also get additional cancers from either metastasis or the chemicals, go throughout a lot of your body. Cardiovascular disease, so heart attacks and strokes are very high with smokers, as well as emphysema, because the damage to the lungs, you can't get the right amount of oxygen into your body and carbon dioxide out. Almost all lung cancer is due to smoking. And, there's never too late of time to quit, but the sooner you do, the better it is, because every time you smoke, you're inhaling chemicals. And those toxins really are damaging the cells, and those cells, when the DNA is damaged, they sometimes, most of the time, repair itself, but sometimes it doesn't. And if the damage happens in a cell gene that's important for regulation of cell division, then you can get out of control cell division and then cancer. So then we come to circulatory systems, which are intricately linked with the respiratory systems, like we just saw. You notice there was lots of capillaries in those pictures, and that's part of the circulatory system. So the circulatory system is looking at exchanging materials between body tissues. So it's sort of this highway that brings nutrients around to the body tissues. It's going to take away carbon dioxide and bring in oxygen. It's going to also remove nitrogenous waste out through the urinary system or excretory system, and keep the body from having toxins build up. Diffusion can occur to do these kinds of exchanges, but that's only going to work in small bodies. Larger bodies need circulatory systems, which are a series of fluid and pumps and tubes. And so in our case, we call the fluid the blood, the pumps the heart, and the blood vessels are the tubes. In smaller organisms that have gastrovascular cavities, that's the cnidarians and flatworms, that acts as their circulatory system. They don't actually have a set of tubes or anything. It's just basically exchange across cell membranes through the gastrovascular cavity, distributing the substance to all the cells. But in a true circulatory system like ours and most animals, you have these three components. There are two main types of circulatory systems: open circulatory systems, so that's arthropods, and many mollusks like our clams, the mussels. So they do have a heart. They have blood vessels, but they're open-ended. You can see that they just dump into the body. And the body fluid and the blood all mix together. Closed circulatory systems are all vertebrates. We saw in the earthworm, and then the cephalopods like the squids and octopuses. They all have a heart, as well as completely enclosed vessels. So blood never mixes with what we call interstitial fluid, which is like the body fluid. They're separate. So vertebrate circulatory systems are called cardiovascular system, and they have three types of blood vessels. Arteries, which carry the blood away from the heart. Veins, which carry blood back to the heart. And between those two, they have these very small blood vessels called capillaries, which is going to be where the exchange happens between arteries and veins. So this is in between the two. Okay, so this is a two-chambered heart system. It's called single circulation, and we see this in fish. So lobe-finned fish, like the coelacanths, and the lungfish, ray-finned fish, that's like your classic fish. Chondrichthyans, which are your sharks and rays, and then lampreys, all have single circulation. So it is basically a single pump, and it just goes around in a big circuit. So it just goes through the heart once. So the blood is going to come into the heart, into the atrium. Then it's going to go to the ventricle. Ventricle is always a stronger pump than the atrium. The ventricle is going to pump it to the gills, where it picks up the gas, it picks up oxygen, drops off carbon dioxide. Then it's going to go to the body, exchange the carbon dioxide and oxygen in the body tissues, and then it's going to go back to the heart, and through the atrium, then the ventricle, back to the gills, etc. All these little beds here, you can see those are capillaries. It's the transition between deoxygenated blood and oxygenated blood. And here's the oxygenated and deoxygenated. So you can sort of see this system here. Here's the pump, the blood. You'll also notice the heart never gets blood with oxygen in it in this one circuit system. So the blood will come in, get pumped to the gills, transitions to oxygenated blood to the body, drops off that oxygen back to the heart, back to the gills. That's different than the tetrapods, the land vertebrates, that have double circulation. So they have two different circuits. One circuit goes from the heart to the lungs, back to the heart. We call that the pulmonary circuit. And one circuit goes from the heart to the body, back to the heart. And that's the systemic circuit. So here's one example. So we see this in amphibians, turtles, snakes, and lizards. They are two atria, which are the smaller, less muscular chambers, and one big ventricle. So this is, you can see the double circulation. So here's the pulmonary circuit, heart, lungs, heart, and the systemic circuit, heart, body, heart. So the oxygen, let's start from, it's coming back from the body after it dropped off its gases, it's oxygen. So it's deoxygenated blood, comes in the atrium, gets pumped into the ventricle. The ventricle pumps it to the lungs. It picks up oxygen in the lungs, comes back to the heart, into the atrium, goes back into the ventricle, then gets pumped to the body, drops that oxygen off at the body, and then deoxygenated comes back into the heart. You can see that there's some mixing of the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood inside the ventricle, but for these organisms, it's generally pretty separate just because of the arrangement of the ventricle itself. Also gives them some advantages because they can divert blood flow when underwater instead of having it go to the lungs. Sometimes it has the option of just going straight to the body and coming back. Other types of land vertebrates have four-chambered hearts, so that's like us. We're in the mammal group. This is also birds and crocodilians. So we have two atria and two ventricles. It's the same thing again with the two circuits like the three-chambered heart. So in this case, there's no mixing of the oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor blood. So oxygen-rich is strictly on the left side of the heart, oxygen-poor is strictly on the right side of the heart. Some things you might hear about when you're at the doctor have to do with the heart. Cardiac output, so then they're looking for that. They can measure how much blood you're pumping per minute from your ventricles to see how well those are working. I'm sure you've had your heart rate measured before, so that's just the number of heartbeats per minute. And then also you may have, or you may know someone with what they call a heart murmur. So heart murmurs are when you have a valve defect. And so the valves are these things here. So when you have a leaky valve, it makes a funny noise when you listen to the heart, and that's the murmur part. But it also does allow the blood to flow backwards, and sometimes that's severe enough to have to get surgery on it. A heart attack is when you have blocking of the blood to the heart. So it's funny, right? Because you're like, well, the heart's full of blood. Why doesn't it just use the blood that's there? Well, the blood is just flowing through the heart. The heart itself has to get blood from capillaries. And so you can see the aorta is where the oxygenated blood comes out of the heart, and that it actually oxygenates itself. And when there's a blockage and there's no oxygen coming into the tissue, that's what causes what we call a heart attack. And that's when your tissue, some of your cardiac tissue dies. And then, of course, it can't. The heart itself has cells that contract, and they can't contract in that area anymore. And if it's enough tissue that has died, then the heart will stop working and the person dies. If it's just a limited amount, the person might survive, but the heart is more susceptible to damage, and it's not working as well, so people can have problems that way. One of the reasons you might have a block to your heart is from cardiovascular disease. Besides blocking the heart, cardiovascular disease can also block other parts of your body, like your brain. And if you have a blockage of flow of blood to the brain, that is what gives you a stroke. Atherosclerosis is that's one of the problems that leads to possibly strokes and heart attacks, is this depositing of plaque along the blood vessels. And that can restrict the blood flow, so you have really high blood pressure, which puts strain on the body. You can also lose part of that plaque, and that can be a clot. And so that can block blood flow to the brain or the heart as well. And then finally, we have to look at the fluid that's in the circulatory system. It's called blood when it's in a closed system. And we look at here, most of the blood is plasma. So plasma is the liquid part. The rest of it are red and white blood cells and platelets. Most of the plasma is water. Then there are also some ions, some proteins for clotting and your immune system, as well as nutrients going around in the body. That's getting distributed to the cells. The rest of the blood is, like I said, the red blood cells, which are also called erythrocytes, the white blood cells, which are called leukocytes, and platelets. Platelets are for clotting when you cut yourself or internally damage tissue. That'll stop the bleeding. White blood cells are for the immune system to work. So they're both fighting in infections as well as cancer. And these two guys, the neutrophils and monocytes, you don't need to know the names, but these are two types of white blood cells, and they're specifically responsible for doing phagocytosis. So if you remember from Bio 1, phagocytosis is when the cell can eat other cells and debris, so it just extends its membrane and engulfs that material, and then it can digest it with its lysosomes inside its cell. And then the red blood cells, as you probably know, those are responsible for carrying the oxygen and carbon dioxide, primarily the oxygen, to the rest of the body, and then picking up more oxygen in the lungs.